scariest thing I've ever seen in my life.
The planes never veered, did they? The jets just went right into it.
The second one, we heard the first one, seen everything flying out of the building. And the second one, we actually seen run right into the building. It came right from behind the building and ran right into the other side of the first tower, the further one down.
We try to calm people down by telling them, you know, the chances of you being involved in a terrorist act is very, very small. What do we tell people now when they walk around New York City and look up and see the trade towers on fire? We see other buildings exploding. We see people crying in the streets. I mean, this is a horrific event, and it's a very, very sad day in American history.
The president chose the king, and he vetoed the bill. We can correct that today. Vote to override. Yield back.
15 of the 19 9/11 terrorists who killed some 3,000 people were Saudi nationals. However, the kingdom's responsibility has never been proven. Indeed, until now, the US has gone out of its way to protect its key Middle Eastern ally. But on Wednesday, the US Congress overturned President Obama's executive veto, allowing the 2015 Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act to pass into law. The Senate gave its approval in May, followed by the House of Representatives in September. The law amends the concept of sovereign immunity that protects states and its employees from being prosecuted in another country.
15 years after that tragedy, we are still learning the fact. But there is mounting evidence that the Saudi government aided and abetted one of the most massive crimes in the United States.
I couldn't get home, and the bin Laden family were all able to get home.
No, they just got and left. The FBI is not been allowed to put the Saudis on a terrorism list up until September 11th.
The President of the United States.
Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists. You are with us or you are with the terrorists.
I'm transmitting these scenes to you from the heart of the American Capitol. This video was shot by Omar al-Bayoumi, a Saudi spy living in the United States on a student visa. Only problem is, he didn't show up to school. And when he was on a work visa, he didn't show up to work. And instead of being a student or a worker in the United States, he was actually paid by a Saudi defense contractor. This video was filmed in late July 1999. During the filming of this video, Bayoumi filmed the Capitol. He filmed the White House. He filmed monuments. He lingered on details a little bit too long in a very suspicious way. He lingered on the things that a spy would have noticed. Now, this tape sat in a London flat after Bayoumi exited the country shortly before 9/11, and it stayed out of sight until just recently, about a year ago. It was uncovered as a result of litigation against the Saudi government by the families of the victims of 9/11. The man behind the camera, Omar al-Bayoumi, the same figure who met the first two hijackers in California, helped them find an apartment, and per later FBI assessments, wasn't just a helpful stranger, but one of the organizers of the 9/11 attacks. Now, who asked for this footage? And why didn't we see it sooner? CBS News reported that it was hidden out of sight. FBI documents show that it should have been transported to the New York field office, but in fact, this specific tape was withheld. It gets worse. In 2016, President Obama vetoed the Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act, JASTA, the law designed to let 9/11 families sue foreign states for aiding terror. He vetoed it. Congress came to the rescue. 97 votes, 97-1 overturned President Obama's veto, and the act became a law, paving the way for the families of the victims of 9/11 to sue the Saudi government and use this tape as evidence A federal judge has just said that that case can proceed to trial. What we are going to see is the trial of a century as the Saudi government faces trial for the atrocities committed on 9/11, and Bayoumi is at the center of it. As we tape this, a federal judge in New York has rejected Saudi Arabia's latest bid to toss the case. The family's claims are headed towards trial, which means evidence, witnesses, and answers on the record. In the tense days after the 9/11 attacks, while most planes were still grounded, multiple charter flights ferried Saudi nationals. Among some of them were members of the bin Laden family out of the United States with very high level approvals, all the way up to the President of the United States, George W. Bush. As this unfolded alongside a U.S.-Saudi relationship so close that Washington insiders nicknamed the kingdom's longtime ambassador Bandar Bush because of his relationship with George Bush. Our story truly begins 20 months before the September 11th attacks. On a sunny day in January in the year 2000, two young Saudi men, Nawaf al-Hazimi and Khalid al-Mindahar, arrived at Los Angeles International Airport on January 15, 2000. They were the first of the 19 terrorists who would carry out the 9/11 plot to enter the United States, hijack planes, and slam them into the towers. Hamzi and Mindahar were al-Qaeda operatives. But at that moment, they were essentially helpless in a foreign land. They spoke almost no English. They had little idea how to navigate American life. Within days of their arrival, these two would-be hijackers found an unlikely benefactor. Not long after they landed in Los Angeles, Hamzi and Mindahar visited a large mosque in the suburb of Culver City, the King Fahd Mosque. It was built and supported by the Saudi government. People there were paid by the Saudi government. It was a haven of Saudi activity. There, when they entered the mosque, they encountered a cheerful, middle-aged Saudi man. His name was Omar al-Bayoumi. Bayoumi was ostensibly a graduate student in California. Over a casual lunch at a local restaurant, a meeting Bayoumi would later insist was pure chance, he struck up a conversation with two nationals. Friendly and fluent in English, Bayoumi offered to help them settle into San Diego, where he lived. In short order, he found them an apartment in San Diego. He co-signed a lease. He even paid their first couple of months' rent out of the goodness of his heart. And when I say he, I mean the Saudi government. At that time, he was working as a Saudi spy. What a remarkable gesture. Hamzi and Mindahar gladly accepted. This lucky break for the hijackers would draw intense scrutiny after 9/11. Who exactly was Omar al-Bayoumi? At first glance, he seemed to be an innocuous figure, a Saudi national in his 40s. In the U.S., he was on a student visa employed on paper by a Saudi contracting company. But FBI investigators would later discover that Bayoumi was not really studying at all, and his income in California was coming directly from the Saudi government, specifically from Saudi aviation and defense contractors linked to the Saudi Ministry of Defense. In fact, the FBI had investigated Bayoumi before 9/11 as a possible Saudi spy. Here was a man on the Saudi government's dime, possibly reporting back to the Saudi government, who had effectively set up two of the future hackers in the United States. Bayoumi wasn't the only Saudi-linked individual to cross paths with Hamdi and Mindahar, the advanced team of the hijackers. Investigators during the 9/11 investigation later identified Fahad al-Thumairy, a diplomat at the Saudi consulate in Los Angeles, and an imam at that same King Fahd Mosque as another key figure. Phone records and witness accounts suggest that Thumairy was in contact with Bayoumi and may have been involved in arranging help for the two hijackers when they first arrived. The 9/11 Commission later confirmed that Bayoumi and Thumairy had both met Hamzi and Mindahar early in 2000 and provided them with extensive assistance. Thumairy, for his part, denied to investigators that he even remembered meeting the hijackers, a claim that U.S. officials openly doubted. But the pattern was clear. A support network was in place. In San Diego, Bayoumi introduced Hamzi and Mindahar, his new hijacker friends, to the local Muslim community. There were gatherings at his apartment and at local restaurants. At one party captured on a home video, Bayoumi presented the two newcomers to his circle of friends. Among those in Bayoumi's orbit was another Saudi, Osama Bassanan, who lived across the street from Hamzi and Mindahar. Bassanan was an eccentric expatriate known to profess admiration for Osama bin Laden. He would later boast astonishingly that he had done even more for the two hijackers than Bayoumi had. Bassanan's bragging aside, what we do know is that Bassanan had suspicious ties. Over a period of years, Bassanan and his wife received tens of thousands of dollars in checks from the Saudi ambassador's wife. Those payments, ostensibly charity for Bassanan's ill wife, coincidentally spanned the time when Hamzi and Mindahar were in San Diego. Investigators suspected this money may have been funneled to support the hijackers, a claim that they weren't able to conclusively prove, but that's because the Saudi government got in the way. By the summer of 2000, Hamzi and Mindahar had built a life of sorts in Southern California, a life facilitated at nearly every step by people with connections to Saudi Arabia. Omar al-Bayoumi eventually left San Diego in mid-2001, moving to London for another purported course of study. Hamzi and Mindahar, for their part, left California to join fellow plotters in other states and prepare for the hijackings. The two Saudi hijackers would go on to hijack American Airlines Flight 77 and crash it into the Pentagon on 9/11. In the aftermath, Bayoumi and Bassan's names surfaced quickly in FBI inquiries. So did Thumairy's. The FBI detained Bayoumi in England in 2001, interviewing him at length. He claimed, though, his encounter with the hijackers was coincidence, and he denied any advanced knowledge of the plot. With no charges filed, Bayoumi was released and promptly fled, of course, back to Saudi Arabia. Thumairy had returned to Saudi Arabia in 2003, but was barred from re-entering the United States after suspicions arose that he had extremist ties. As for Osama Bassanan, he left the country after 2001, reportedly deported on visa charges by the United States government. Even as these characters exited the stage, more strange connections emerged. In September 2001, Hussein was visiting the United States on business. By pure chance, or perhaps not, Hussein happened to be staying at the Marriott residence in Hotel Herndon, Virginia, on September 10th, 2001. Incredibly, three of the hijackers, including Hani Hanjour, the pilot of Flight 77, were also staying at the very same hotel on the night before the attacks. FBI agents later tried to interview Hussein about this, but he reportedly feigned a medical emergency in the middle of questioning, and the interview was cut short. A dramatic scene witnessed by at least one skeptical agent just days later, once the post-9/11 flight ban was lifted. Saleh al-Hussein was allowed to fly out of the United States and return to Saudi Arabia. Within months, back in Saudi Arabia, he was promoted into the government, put in charge of the holy mosque in Mecca and Medina. Hussein has always maintained his innocence, and indeed no evidence has ever surfaced that he interacted with the hijackers at the hotel, but the mere fact of a Saudi official's uncanny proximity to the plotters raised yet more eyebrows among investigators. By now, a pattern was forming for investigators. Multiple Saudi-connected individuals, Bayoumi, Thumairy, Bassanan, Hussein, each of them in their own way intersected with the 9/11 hijackers. Yet officially, the U.S. government, George Bush's position after 9/11 was that the attackers had no outside support from Saudi Arabia. The 9/11 Commission report in 2004 famously stated, a line used by Saudi Arabia Defense Council, it stated, "We found no evidence that the Saudi government as an institution or senior Saudi officials individually funded al-Qaeda." The 9/11 Commission report in 2004 famously stated that it found no evidence that the Saudi government, as an institution or senior Saudi officials, individually funded al-Qaeda to carry out. The line was carefully worded. It did not rule out the involvement of lower-level Saudi officials or unofficial actors. In fact, the commission quietly noted that Saudi Arabia was the primary source of al-Qaeda financing. And it acknowledged that the actions of men like Bayoumi and Thumairy were suspicious. But the public heard the headline, Saudi Arabia cleared, and that largely ended the story for a while. Behind the scenes, however, some investigators were far from satisfied. One of those unsatisfied investigators was Senator Bob Graham, a Democrat from Florida, who co-chaired the earlier 2002 congressional inquiry into 9/11. Graham had seen more than most. His inquiry dug deeply into classified FBI and CIA files, uncovering many of the Saudi leads we've described here in this video so far. In December 2002, that congressional inquiry produced a report with an entire final chapter exploring specific sources of foreign support for the hijackers. In other words, it delved into the Saudi connections. But when the report was released to the public, that entire chapter, 28 full pages, was censored by President George W. Bush. Those 28 pages quickly became legendary. Evidence so explosive that the government decided that Americans couldn't be allowed to see it. The worst atrocity in American history, and 28 pages related to the causes, were redacted from the American people. For nearly 13 years, the 28 pages remained locked in a vault. Senators and congressmen who managed to read the classified report hinted at its contents, but faced prosecution for revealing it. It pointed a very strong finger at Saudi Arabia as being the principal financier of the 9/11 plot, according to Senator Graham himself. Others described the material as shocking, but the Bush administration's refusal to declassify the pages, citing national security, remained the law. Even President Barack Obama, when he took office, for most of his 2 terms, kept the secrecy intact despite growing pleas from 9/11 families and bipartisan lawmakers. When officials pressed, he offered patronizing explanations. In 2016, CIA Director John Brennan, Obama's top intelligence chief, argued against releasing the 28 pages, gaslighting the American public, saying the Americans would misinterpret the raw, unvetted information and unfairly implicate Saudi Arabia. To families like Terry Strada, whose husband Tom was killed in the World Trade Center, such excuses were infuriating. Where's the outrage? Strada asked. Strada and others demanded answers, but for years were met only with silence or deflection from the U.S. official Washington narrative. What was in those 28 pages that made the White House so weary, both administrations? When they were finally declassified in July of 2016, the public got a glimpse. The pages detailed numerous ties between Saudi Arabia individuals and the 9/11 hijackers. Perhaps the most dramatic information that they revealed was that the money from the very top levels of the Saudi royal family had made its way directly and indirectly to the network that supported the hijackers. For example, the report cited FBI evidence that at least $15,000 was sent from the bank account of Prince Bandar bin Sultan, the longtime Saudi ambassador in Washington and best friend of George W. Bush, to the family of a Saudi national in California who helped the hijackers. This Saudi helper is widely believed to be Omar al-Bayoumi, described in the report as a suspected Saudi government spy. The prince and the ambassador, best friend to George W. Bush, depositing money into the financier of the hijackers' account, was kept from the American people for 15 years. The pages also confirmed that Prince Bandar's wife, Princess Haifa, had written personal checks totaling $74,000 to Osama bin Laden's family between 1999 and 2002. Investigators suspected, but were never able to prove, much of that money ended up in the hands of the two hijackers in San Diego. But wait, it gets worse. When a senior al-Qaeda operative named Abdu Zubaydah was captured in Pakistan in 2002, among his belongings was a phone book. In it, the investigators found an unlisted phone number for a company managing Prince Bandar's Colorado estate and a phone number for a bodyguard in Bandar's Washington security detail. Why would a captured al-Qaeda member have contacts linked to the Saudi ambassador? It was a chilling clue hinting at connections that reached into the Saudi elite and very close to President Bush. Bandar, a gregarious figure nicknamed Bandar Bush for his close friendship with President George W. Bush, dismissed any such implications. Saudi Arabia's government has always vehemently denied that it knowingly aided the 9/11 plot, and indeed, there's no evidence that the highest Saudi rulers had foreknowledge of September 11th, but that's because they've thrown a lot of interference at the investigation. But the 28 pages made it clear that at a minimum, elements of the Saudi establishment, whether officials or well-connected individuals, were entwined with the hijackers in very, very troubling ways, enough to violate U.S. felony laws for material support to terrorism. Despite that, prosecutions were not brought and evidence was hidden. Just as troubling was how the U.S. government responded to these facts. Instead of aggressively investigating Saudi leads, senior officials in the White House and FBI seemed more interested in diffusing them and gaslighting the American public. Former Senator Graham later accused the U.S. government of a pattern of protecting Saudi Arabia at every turn, placing Saudi sensitives above the pursuit of justice for American victims. At virtually every step of the judicial process, he said, the U.S. government took positions adverse to its own citizens seeking the truth, were slow walking or shutting down many of those inquiries, putting the brakes on while federal investigators tried to hit the gas. Some of the strongest calls for action came from within the United States government itself, from officials in both political parties who grew frustrated at the secrecy. It wasn't just Bob Graham sounding the alarm. Representative Walter Jones, a Republican from North Carolina, and Representative Stephen Lynch, a Democrat from Massachusetts, joined forces to demand the release of the 28 pages. They read the classified report and were stunned by what they saw. I do not understand how you can have a strong foreign policy when you are trying to hide the truth from American people, Representative Jones said pointedly. Other members of Congress from both sides of the aisle echoed that sentiment. And on the 9/11 Commission itself, which had been diplomatic towards Saudi Arabia, in its final report, at least one commissioner later expressed regret. John Lehman, a Republican who served as a Navy secretary in the 1980s, said he was sorry the commission's report was read as an exoneration of the Saudis. When the 28 pages came out in 2016, Lehman said they showed why additional investigation into Saudi ties to 9/11 was needed. The trail of evidence may be a little cold, Lehman said, but it's time for a complete reprisal of our relationship with the Saudis. He noted that both Bush and Obama administrations failed to pressure Saudi Arabia, whether to fully investigate 9/11 links or to curb export of its violent Wahhabi ideology. And inside the FBI, too, there were pockets of frustration. In 2007, years after the official 9/11 case was closed, a small team of FBI agents quietly launched a follow-up investigation, codenamed Operation Encore. These brave agents took up the cause where their seniors said they shouldn't. The focus of this operation was precisely the question we're examining. Did anyone assist the hijackers, particularly Hamzi and Mindahar, on U.S. soil? For nearly a decade, the Encore team dug into the Saudi angle. They uncovered new evidence and even some alarming missteps by their own bureau. At one point, the Encore agents learned that the FBI archivists were on the verge of destroying evidence seized from Bayoumi back in 2001. Among items saved by this team, just in time, was a notebook containing a hand-drawn diagram that shockingly depicted the flight path of a commercial airliner diving toward the ground, eerily similar to the flight path 77 took into the Pentagon, a place that Bayoumi filmed. A former pilot who later examined the sketch told the FBI there was a reasonable basis to suspect it was used in planning the attack. Why would such an item taken from Bayoumi's belongings ever be marked for disposal? Is storage space at the FBI so scarce that items related to 9/11 and our national history must be destroyed? No, that's not the case. The deeper Encore looked, the more questions arose. Agents discovered that Bayoumi's generous stipend in California had come from a Saudi contractor linked to the kingdom's defense ministry, evidence that he was an unofficial agent on Saudi's payroll. They confirmed that Bayoumi and Thumairy had far more frequent contact than either admitted, suggesting coordination. They also forced dozens of other Saudi students or officials to leave the U.S. in those years, people suspected of ties to extremist networks. But in case after case, higher-ups in Washington seemed uninterested in prosecuting. By 2016, the Encore agents were running out of road. That year, FBI headquarters shut down the dedicated Encore team, effectively mothballing the investigation and any truth that may come out. One agent bitterly described how little support they got from the FBI leadership. Sensing the end, one senior analyst on the team took an unusual step. Before transferring out, he compiled a detailed 16-page summary of Encore's findings and placed it in the FBI system, essentially leaving a time capsule for future investigators. What a brave agent. So the facts couldn't be buried or forgotten. Throughout this period, families of 9/11 victims kept up the pressure in public and in court. They fought to reopen the case and sued the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, alleging complicity in the attacks. Successive U.S. administrations responded not just with secrecy, but aggressive secrecy and legal roadblocks. The Bush administration, famously close to the Saudis, had set the tone by classifying the Saudi filings. The Obama administration, too. I don't want to fight the Saudis, he said, fearing disruption of a key alliance. In fact, in 2016, President Obama vetoed a bill that would allow the 9/11 families just to sue Saudi Arabia in the United States courts out of concern for diplomatic relations. Congress, in a very rare bipartisan rebuke, overrode Obama's veto, which is almost unheard of, making the Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act, JASTA, the law and opening the door. Why did Obama veto this? Well, he thought that the Iran deal would be one of the biggest accomplishments in his entire presidency, and it seems that he negotiated vetoing that bill for their support in the Iran deal. Still, in court, the Justice Department continued to side with Saudi Arabia as recently as 2019, as the Trump administration invoked state secrets to block the release of FBI files that might shed light on Saudi involvement. One former senior U.S. intelligence official summed it up. The Bush administration was cozy with the Saudis, and Obama didn't want to fight. Efforts to safeguard Saudi sensitivities date back to both the Bush and Obama administrations. A demand for secrecy and transparency took 20 years and a new president. In September 2021, amid pressure from the 9/11 families on the eve of the attacks, the 20th anniversary, President Biden ordered declassification of long secret FBI documents related to the Saudi investigation. Slowly, more pieces of the puzzle have emerged. A previously hidden FBI report from 2017 revealed that the Bureau now officially assessed Omar al-Bayoumi to have been a Saudi intelligence agent all along, one who had been tasked to assist the hijackers upon their arrival. Another newly disclosed document from 2020 went further. FBI analysts stated there was a 50-50 chance that Bayoumi had advanced knowledge of the 9/11 plot. In other words, they believed it was likely that this purported student, this helpful stranger This person who met the hijackers at the restaurant knew what al-Qaeda was planning to do, and he had fresh Prince Bandahar bucks in his pocket. Bayoumi, of course, denied this. The Saudi government also continues to deny that he or Thumairy or anyone in its employ was involved in the attacks, and they have refused to extradite them. Today, 2 decades later, this story is not over. A federal lawsuit, one of the longest-running lawsuits in history, filed by the 9/11 survivors' families against Saudi Arabia, is finally moving forward in a New York courtroom. The plaintiffs hope to force more evidence into the open and perhaps hold the kingdom accountable, at least financially, for the support that enabled the worst terrorist act on U.S. soil. The Saudi government is fighting the case vigorously through its counsel paid hundreds of millions of dollars, and it maintains that any contacts its citizens had with the hijackers were incidental, not part of the state-sponsored plot. The truth of that claim remains a matter of investigation and debate, but material support to terrorism still remains a federal crime in the United States, as how much of Bandahar's money is in the pocket of the hijacker. As we pull together, the portrait emerges as a complex and often uncomfortable investigation, but alliance between Saudi Arabia and the United States, one that led U.S. leaders to tread carefully, perhaps too carefully, U.S. investigators to hide evidence and attempt to destroy it. The reasons are not hard to fathom. Saudi Arabia has been a strategic ally, a major oil supplier, a partner in the Middle East, and before fracking, the Bush family certainly relied on that relationship. In the wake of 9/11, President Bush stood side by side with Bandahar as a friend. Years later, Obama likewise sought to maintain strong ties for his chief accomplishment, the Iran deal, relying on Saudi cooperation against new threats like ISIS, threats that were caused by Saudi Arabia. Rocking the boat by accusing the kingdom of complicity in 9/11 was something no president was eager to do. Remember, the office of the president is a giant popularity contest, and high oil prices can often be difficult to overcome. And so much of this tale languished in the shadow for years, while real victims, real people sought answers and were denied. The families of those killed on 9/11 have never given up seeking answers and have pursued justice every step of the way. Their message is simple. Transparency and accountability are crucial, even if it means confronting an inconvenient truth, to borrow the phrase, about a powerful ally. 24 years have passed since the 2 Saudi hijackers accepted a stranger's help in California, and 22 years since the Saudi royals and bin Laden kin flew safely home from Kentucky while Ground Zero smoldered and victims were still trapped. These lingered questions demanded clarity, not confusion. And in the end, this is not about relitigating the past for its own sake. It's about closure, justice, and lessons for the future. As one 9/11 family member put it, he has the power to give us closure, referring to the U.S. president's ability to reveal the remaining secrets. The September 11th attacks were a crime that shook the world. If parts of that crime were facilitated even slightly by people connected to a foreign government and people connected to our government, then a shining light on that is not a luxury, it's a necessity for democracy. It's necessary for families who carry the loss every day and for a nation that pledged to leave no stone unturned in understanding how this happened. Our investigation tonight has pulled back the curtain on just one facet of the 9/11 story, the Saudi connection. But it's a facet that was long obscured. We end not on that note, but with further inquiry, further transparency into the hijackings on 9/11, further accountability for those inside of Washington as required. And of course, during this investigation and multiple episodes of Off Air, we're going to be talking about some pretty high-profile names, like Barack Obama, James Comey, Hillary Clinton, the usual players, and their role in defending Saudi Arabia and preventing the truth. The story of 9/11 is still being written. We're not going to let this ink dry. It's up to us, citizens, people with a conscience, to insist that the final chapters be open and honest and complete, and only then can we truly close the book on 9/11's most enduring mysteries. My name's Ron Chapman. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Off Air. On the next episode, we're going to dive deeper into the 9/11 conspiracy and Saudi Arabia's involvement, as well as the litigation against Saudi Arabia and why this trial may be one of the biggest trials in history.